Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. With me today, I have Paul Dudley, who is founder and CEO of StreamCap, the streaming company. I'm super excited to talk to you, Paul, today. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Ivo. Glad to be on and appreciate you inviting me.
Right. So before we go into the details of streaming and real time infrastructure and all that, can you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how it came about to founding the company?
Yeah, so if you want to go way back, most recently I had another data startup, and then I worked with my co-founder at another data startup. We'll come back around to that, but I started out my career as an analyst. I studied physics and kind of realized I wasn't going to be a scientist, but said, oh, well, what can I combine this sort of general understanding of technical things with maybe talking to people more? And so I said, I'm going to be an analyst. Was what I decided on. I ended up working at a tech company that was actually doing natural language processing back when it was a lot more. That was the cutting edge, and it was we were figuring things out, but it didn't work super well. And then that was kind of my entry into like SaaS companies and would be into analytics as well. That company was originally trying to do some like R&D related research stuff with NLP, but that didn't really work. So we pivoted to doing social media analytics very early in the social media era. And I actually got pulled into more of a sales role there over time and ultimately led sales for that company. Then I went to like another sort of marketing analytics SEO company for a number of years after that, again, mostly in sales. And then my kind of reentry into like more pure data stuff was working for my now co-founder at a data company he started called Avora that was in London. And basically Avora was kind of similar to like Domo, I guess, today, where it was everything end to end. So you had data ingestion, you had data warehousing built on Snowflake. We had our own data modeling layer for a while, but switched to we were early users of DBT, and then dashboards and some ML insights. If we were doing it today, we would have called it AI. And ultimately, I think it's funny like that didn't work out. We lost some big customers during COVID, and anyway, but one of the things that was interesting about it was like I think if you were launching that company today, it would probably be more attractive than, and it was just sort of a bad timing. Like my co-founder kind of was building it into the disaggregation of the modern data stack, and it was kind of not the right tool at that time. And then he and I did a batch ETL company, so like kind of a direct Fivetran competitor after that, which we ultimately sold. And actually both at Avora and at Gravity, the batch ETL company, we'd seen more people doing streaming, but we had heard really kind of consistent themes from them, like that they were spending months getting production data pipelines, and it was a lot of overhead. And then we were also seeing like an increase in demand for it. So we said, well, like there's something there, right? Like if we could make this easier, bring the experience that we had built, in the batch ETL world to streaming, that will get more people doing it. And then I think we had some further reinforcement that was a good opportunity with, we got to know the folks at ClickHouse and Rockset and Imply, which are all kind of, well, Rockset is no longer, but all kind of real-time oriented databases. And we said, okay, I think there's probably an opportunity here in the real-time space, to do for ClickHouse and others what Fivetran did for Snowflake in the batch world and getting data into those systems. So that's kind of what we set out to do with StreamCap when we started in 2022.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the timing of the market is something extremely interesting, and I feel like it's more important to the software world now than it has ever been before, right? Since previously you had to build for this particular platforms, you can take your time, you can plan, and now it's just like velocity of everything is just so much quicker that the timing the market properly is almost more important than the idea itself.
Yeah, and I mean that's hard, right? Like I'm sure there's a lot of people in AI who, maybe who started 5 years ago, who I don't know, maybe they built they were trying to build an AI assisted coding thing, and and then Cursor comes along and
Oh,
is
it's
the fastest growing
we'll talk
company ever,
about
right?
that in a moment.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just because I think the cursor and the cursor, are you the cursor for X, Y, and Z is like a whole other topic that I'd like to get your opinion on. But tell us a little bit more about this kind of the market need. Like, I mean, you have increasing expectations at enterprise customers for like more streaming. You
Yeah.
have real time tracking, personalization, just low latency here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't want to have the whole teams that are managing the whole Kafka
Yeah.
infrastructure. What's the challenge to
Yeah.
prompt you to say, you know what, I want to go with something like StreamCap?
Yeah. So, I think a lot of the specific use cases that we were seeing were generally, it was not like a BI type use case. It's pretty unusual that, like, for internal reporting purposes, you really need low latency. But so usually it's some kind of customer facing or operational use cases where we would see it. So you have, in payments, you have fraud payments, e-commerce, you get fraud detection. Also in e-commerce, you have personalization. Well, actually in e-commerce and elsewhere, consumer kind of things, you have personalization, where having real-time data is really important. In kind of operational heavy businesses like logistics and manufacturing, there's a lot of areas where, just for internal purposes, it's really helpful to have real-time data. So in financial services, you have trading, things like that, where it becomes important. So these were some of the areas that we were seeing that there was existing demand. And I think the classic view has been, data people have like trained themselves, and you see this on LinkedIn or whatever, people talking about like just like the stakeholder asked for real time and here's how you push back, right? You ask them like, well, do they really need it? You're trying to, the classic view I think has been of the last 15 years is generally like the first reaction to do we need low latency data is to push back and see if we really need it. And the big reason for that is, by the way, it's very sensible, because traditionally it's been expensive and complicated to manage. And so, you should be pushing back and making sure that it makes sense, right? And what we started to see was like there's an opportunity, to make it easier, but both in terms of what we were doing, but also just like the ecosystem around it, right? Like we started in 2022. We work a lot with Snowflake. In like early 2022, your best option for dealing with streaming data in Snowflake is, you're using Snowpipe, which is, you're landing the data in S3 and then you're actually micro batching it into Snowflake. So there's just like some extra services to manage, and that was kind of the best way to do it. But from 2017, I think, to 2022. But then in 2022, Snowflake released Snowpipe Streaming, somewhat confusingly, very similar name. But, all of a sudden, you had like a more direct streaming into Snowflake, and it's a separate serverless process. And, it's actually cheaper. In fact, in a lot of cases, it's the cheapest way to get data in, right? So now you have, if you're on Snowflake, it's like the actual, you kind of flip, at least just from a data ingestion perspective, to streaming is actually advantageous because you get the data in low latency, but you also just, it's cheaper anyway. So there's kind of no reason not to use it.
Just to pause you for a moment, because I think it's quite important to understand. Previously, in projects, in investment decisions, people would go, to the CIO. The CIO go say, do you need it? Do you need this? I mean, obvious monthly report on a daily basis. People are like, no, and it's like, yeah, well, you don't need to stream, you don't need current, haha. So it's such an obvious. I mean, yeah, that's like a first order obvious case of you don't need that. But then what if you actually need this? And what if the economics change? What if the technology changes in a way where you're actually using it in real time becomes actually more, done more cheaply? And I think this is where the smarter solution and the smarter team should look for something like this and not rest on assumptions that were made years ago
Yeah.
about how things work. I mean, you obviously don't need all of your Power BI reports in real time. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that there might be cases where it'll actually be advantageous. So this rethinking due to the technology shift is important, especially around people going into Databricks and Snowflake.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's like, if we look at the Snowflake case, right? Like if now, let's say you're using StreamCap, like we're equivalent, we're as easy to use as Fivetran, to pick on a specific vendor, and we're streaming by default, right? And Snowflake, with Stovepipe streaming, you have a cheaper way to get data in, and it happens also to be very fast, right? So now, like by default, the data is in Snowflake, in the raw data, let's say, is in Snowflake, in a couple of seconds from your source databases. And then to your point, then you're just making a decision in Snowflake about, for a given use case, like how fast do you want to turn the dial, right? So you probably don't change your cadence of maybe some of the in Power BI reporting, because you just don't need to. And so that's, now maybe it's a little bit cheaper than it was before, but you're not actually using the latency there. But then if you have some other use cases where it actually is advantageous, the lift to move it faster is just saying like, okay, I'm going to run Snowflake a little bit faster. And they've also made some of that stuff easier with like dynamic tables, where you can just set a target latency and Snowflake figures out like what's the most efficient way to get there. So, and I'm using Snowflake as an example. We work a lot with them. But Databricks also has improved sort of handling of lower latency stuff. ClickHouse is really good at low latency stuff. We don't see it used as much in a data warehousing type context anyway. It's usually more in customer facing type of use cases. But in that case, you're kind of getting sub-second latency end to end with ClickHouse.
I mean, if they wanted to capture the share of kind of OLTP, which they're going into this kind of Postgres, world, right? Both of them, Snowflake and Databricks. Then this goes also into these real-time use cases, right? You want to have a transactional system. Transactional system has to get data from somewhere somehow and still be within the same, governance space and all that. So how do you think the need to also transform the data while streaming it, where does that fit in this whole picture?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of, we actually are just have a beta. Well, we've been doing transformations for customers in, let's say, an alpha mode for like over a year. And we just released a beta of our, of that functionality. And I've been, we knew people had use cases for it. That's why we built it. But I've been somewhat surprised by how many of the folks I talked to actually have a use case for it, because I think a lot of people moved to an ELT model, which made a lot of sense, right? Especially relative to this kind of legacy ETL, where it was brittle and opaque, and you had all inexpensive. Relative to that, like ELT was really really attractive, because you, especially in the like a DBTs of the world, where you're versioning things, and you can kind of treat that data modeling, the transformation step, as a much more kind of software development type of process. But like if you think about it, while those were things that happened to come along with ELT, it wasn't necessarily like an inherent component, inherently true for ELT versus ETL. It just happened to be that you had DBT kind of coming along with that and bringing those practices. So those principles can apply in an ETL model, but you have to just bring that to the ETL world. So I think that's going to be kind of opening up a little bit, and I think folks will look at where is it best to run this compute, essentially, right? And there's some cases where we see various reasons for why people want to do transformation. So in the stream, one of them is very simple, which is maybe they have some PI data or something like that. They just don't want it to go into. They want to limit the distribution of that as much as possible, and so if they can drop it or mask it as a part of the stream, that's often preferable. And that's kind of maybe the simplest one. In other cases, we have sort of more complex underlying database environments. So a cell-based architecture, or a large number of single tenant source databases. Maybe you're a SaaS company and you've got a source data, like a Postgres or MySQL for every customer that you've got. You don't necessarily want thousands of or hundreds of thousands, as is the case for some of our customers, of schemas in Snowflake, because it's the same basic data. So what we can do is join that up into like a single schema. So maybe you have like to put a little more color on that. Like you have 5 tables for every customer in those single tenant databases. They're all the same schema, and you just want to you append the database name basically as a new column, rather than have it as a separate schema in Snowflake. So, and that makes just things a lot more efficient in Snowflake, a lot less expensive. And then you have more complex things, like you're maybe doing some enrichment, or you're doing joins of different data types. So we have customers who have database data that they're joining with clickstream data, and then streaming that into well, that's more powering real-time personalization. But yeah, there's a variety of reasons why we see folks looking at that. And then one pattern that we're starting to see a little bit more of is, I guess all of those have like a pretty hard requirement to do it in the stream for latency reasons, and I guess to a certain extent for cost. But the other one I think we're seeing, especially, I think also we'll see more of this with Iceberg coming into play more, is, you just, that question of which compute to use in a particular context is going to open up more, right? Like in a cloud data warehouse world, like you just dumped all the data there and all the compute was going to run there. But if you're storing an Iceberg on object storage, the tool you use to run compute is less locked in, right? And so you might do more of your ETL workloads as a part of stream processing, and then use a Snowflake or something like that as your query engine for your reporting and things like that.
And also, this compute is also, if you're like, I mean, if you're a bank, if you're like a high frequency, low latency use case, I mean, you should do it at where the compute cost,
Yeah,
is bearable. There's no need to overdo it by transforming a large piece of information if you can just transform a small piece of information in that stream and then
exactly.
and just
Yeah,
land
there's
it
a lot
there.
of cases where doing it in memory and stream is going to be a lot more efficient than putting in a
Yeah.
database and then doing it, right? So
Yeah.
exactly.
It's an interesting space, because there's like, I mean, there's a lot of solutions out there. Everything is claiming, we CDC, we, stream, we live. But ultimately, if you actually, I mean, we had experiences with multiple tools, interesting brand names, and not everything works as advertised. Okay. So it's, some of those things are just either very hard to configure, very hard to set up in a private environment, or otherwise you quickly realize it's sounds great, doesn't work. Right.
Yeah. In the past, there's promises of this thing, this stream processing and streaming transformations, but didn't always work out. More complex, than you would want. I think that's a very consistent feedback we've heard from folks, and that's kind of like at the center of what we really set out to do. Was, I mean, I think our worldview is like, in there's a if you think about like a quadrant, and there's like, at the top you have do it for me, and at the bottom you do it yourself, and then you've got batch on one side and streaming on the other side. And in the batch world, you've got, let's say, Fivetran. It's a do it for me batch, and then Airflow or Spark or something like that is a do it yourself batch. And then on the streaming side, you had Kafka, and that's a do it yourself streaming, Kafka and Flink, and then maybe Confluent or something like that is like a managed Kafka, but it's still kind of on the do it yourself side of the spectrum. And so we felt like just like that quadrant of do it for me streaming didn't really exist, and that's really what we wanted.
Absolutely.
To do.
It didn't, and there's a lot of the use cases that require streaming is not you're the Uber of the world or like a major bank. But even smaller banks, don't have the capability to kind of run a team to manage their Kafka, right? I mean, it's just too much, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So, and that's really, so that's what we set out, and we found it, there's definitely, I think the combination of providing an easy service, and then also, as I was saying about like Snowflake and others, like the ecosystem around it developing, where the databases you're using or have better support for streaming, that all of a sudden, like the barriers that existed before, where it was something that, like I said, we had those trade-offs of it being more expensive and more complex, now are flipping around, and it's it's no more complex, and it's in some cases cheaper to do. Then all of a sudden, like, why wouldn't you do it? And we've seen that, right? Like, we've seen folks they start out with like the most critical path stuff, like, okay, we've got to stream our transactional data in this customer facing experience, and that's business critical. They were doing it before with Amazon MSK or something, and like, so they moved that workload to us because it's this is for point of sale, by the way. They want to get that critical stuff and just work less, have it be less complex to work on. So we solve that problem, and then all of a sudden, when it's easy, they're like, well, actually, in addition to this core transactional data, let's send some loyalty data and some marketing data, and we can build on that too, because there's no sort of downside. So you kind of see this expansion, like when you make it easy and it's cost competitive with batch, you're like, well, we may as well do more, right? Because it's what is it, like the Jevons paradox kind of stuff that everybody was fond of talking about around DeepSeek launch. Is like, you have when it becomes cheaper to do something, you actually just do more of it, and then it expands to fill the space essentially.
Yeah, so the it is always the case, because if the cost of something drops, you just use more of it. It's the same discussion that we have with AI, right? If the price of intelligence drops, we're just going to have more usage of it. We're not going to have less usage of it. And it just shocks me that basic economics in general, just a general remark, are just so uncommon in terms of knowledge.
Yeah.
So can you share a little bit more about where things are going and where your roadmap is going? I mean, I think you recently raised a funding round.
Yeah.
Just you're growing, you're expanding your teams, you're ramping up this innovation cadence. And what are some of the interesting things that you think will change the whole streaming and batching and data movement space?
So, yeah, I think transformations broadly is a big one. Well, it's a big one for us, and I think it has a lot of impact. We kind of covered a lot of that ground already, but I would reiterate that I think Iceberg is really interesting on that front, right? Like, in terms of opening up the like where you run compute, and um, and then AI, obviously, it goes without saying that, like, you want to be thinking about that. I think, like, my view on the world today, as far as that goes, is obviously things are moving super fast. I think for a lot of enterprises, that speed has made it very difficult for them to build their own custom stuff around AI, right? So it's one thing to buy an end-to-end service that that delivers an outcome for you, like a cursor, I don't know, like customer support type solutions and call center solutions, which I think people are buying. But I think it's very different if you're like a CIO in a large enterprise and you're thinking about, like, how do we build a stack to, like, leverage our internal data for some use case. I don't know. My kind of thinking goes back. If you look at the beginning of last year, if you're that CIO, you're thinking like, okay, we need to build with, like, blanking on the term, but anyway, we need to do fine tuning. That's right. So at the beginning of last year, if the state of the art was fine tuning, right, and then in the middle of last year you were doing RAG, and then at the end of last year it's like, is RAG, do we still need RAG, and then it's agents, right? And so, like, if you're a CIO or of a large company that things take 6 months to build, you see how fast things are moving. Like, are you going to try
It
and
is
build your own
absolutely
stuff,
crazy.
right?
It's absolutely crazy. For the first time, you can see that it shocked both the most innovative people in the teams and the most stubborn, hanging on the old ways in the data space. We have enough of them.
Yeah.
We love these guys. They're really the ones that upon which the whole data infrastructure rests. But everyone is struggling equally to figure out what's going on, and what would be the quickest and best and most stable way to bring context from your
Yeah.
data, regardless of which operational system it is, or analytical downstream, whatever, to some AI model to do something for you. Like,
Yeah.
what's the most quickest way?
Yeah. And I think, so I think people are doing that with Snowflake and Databricks and the native models and Cortex and like on the Databricks one. But so that's like relatively easy. And certainly for like small, I don't know, I hear from folks like, oh yeah, we used it for this translation project and it worked really great, right? Like, but I still think those bigger things, like building your own agents or something like that, is still like pretty, we're still very early in that. But that's actually where I think there's a lot of interesting real-time data, right? If you think about, this isn't true for every agentic workload, but for a lot of them, like, it becomes very important that your agent is context aware and it knows what's happening in real time. So, if you think about a customer support agent, one way to do that is you have docs and FAQ and things like that you train the agent on, that's nice. But actually, I'll use a StreamCap example, right? So for us, like, we have that information. We could we could use that to train an agent, and that's that takes, maybe that's a 20 or 40% productivity lift, because it's our team isn't answering kind of the same questions that exist in the docs. But to really answer the hardest problems, the system needs to know, like, what was that user doing in the application at that time, right? Like, what's their click stream of what page they're on, and what did they try to do. It needs to know, like, if there was an error, like, what's the error log that's coming out, right? And so that's all real time data that would make it much more useful, right? Than just kind of regurgitating the FAQ and docs. But that's a lot harder, right? There's a number of considerations. One of them is that you need to get the data there in real time into your model. But there are others like security and things like that where you don't necessarily want to ship all that information to OpenAI's API, right? You might want to run that model locally if you have more sensitive
And
data.
people would do it regardless. I mean, but no, absolutely. I think the use cases that become possible once something like this is done easily and quickly and cheaply change the game as an internal variable, right? Because then all of a sudden you'd get your hands on more fresh or more quality data than otherwise for whatever you're doing. And then the agent actually can become an agent, not just simply a automated workflow, right? At what point you'd call the script a pipeline, all of a sudden an agent? I mean,
Yeah,
there's a threshold where you can say, okay, the baby is out of kindergarten and goes to school, and this is where it could actually interact with the applications in real
yeah,
time and get the data and be able to take the decisions that he needs to take. So I
yeah,
fully
yeah,
agree, and I think we hopefully are going to see more streaming in use cases where everyone is still thinking, just building new systems with Snowflake and Databricks, and still thinking the old ways, the way you model a SQL server, right? Because
yeah.
back in the day, because that's what people know, that's what's worked for 20 years. In this case, you just have to show them cool use cases and let them know what's possible. What do you think is like the most difficult thing to scale a startup like StreamCap, like going to market or recruiting? What is the area that you think is like the most challenging?
I think I don't know. It changes as you go, right? I think right now we've kind of built like the first level of our go to market, and that's been working reasonably well. But now we're trying to scale that to a team. So, recently hired folks in marketing and an SDR onto the team to help kind of scale things up. So moving from most of that coming through me into other people is great actually. Like there's challenges with it, but once you find the right people, it's obviously a huge multiplier to be able to scale that to other folks. But it is important to finding good people is challenging, right? So that's something that I don't know. To date, one thing that's worked for us, which is not going to be scalable forever for sure, but we have a combination of just using our network and finding people that we kind of can trust based on that, and come in with a high degree of confidence that they're gonna work out. And we've also been doing some kind of contract work with folks before we hire full time. Gives us a chance, gives both StreamCap and the potential employee the opportunity to to see if it's a good fit. And that's actually been pretty successful for us. So, like I said, I don't know if that scales to as we get to a bigger organization, but for now, like that's been a great way for us to kind of mutually
Absolutely.
build trust.
Absolutely. And with me and with our company is similar. So you want to hire people in essentially in almost anything you can think of that are better than you are at whatever you're trying to recruit
Yeah,
for.
yeah,
That's the point. And the goal is for you to be positively surprised that they would be more knowledgeable in marketing, more knowledgeable in sales, more knowledgeable in engineering, and in whatever aspect that than you. And you just have to make sure that they can work unblocked
yeah, yeah.
and unleash their potential, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I'm definitely not the best at all of those things. The thing that like you transfer is like that, you have the one person doing it means that you don't have any contact. You don't have to share any context externally. And so that's the thing I think there's some learning around is like, okay, how do you like do knowledge transfer? And like, all of a sudden your communication internally becomes more important as you get bigger, obviously. And then, actually to put a more concrete answer on your question about what's hardest, is I would say it's probably the prioritization of where we spend our time, right? Like, and
Right,
particularly
right.
from a product development perspective, because there are a lot of interesting opportunities and we get questions for customers for different things. And like, I think that was early on. I think we if we made a mistake early, it was probably that we tried to do too much. And for example, like build too many connectors at once, right? You know, and so a big part of what we've done this year, in addition to building out transformations, is like core platform stuff, just like cleaning up maybe tech debt and things like that, which is not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's been critical because that's allowing us to scale more because it means we have fewer little bugs and things like that that were taking engineering time to to go deal with from a support perspective and stuff like that. So that's been a big focus for us this year, is like okay, like we're really going to be ruthless about prioritization about what we're building. And that means that there are things that are really exciting that we would love to do, which we're not going to do right now. And that's really
Right.
hard, right? Because you're like, I know if we do this, like we're solving a real problem for customers, and there's a ton of revenue there. But we're doing the thing that we think has solving the biggest problems and has the most revenue potential, and then we'll do that other thing, later.
Right.
That is,
It's like this really is kind of where you need to. I mean, even if you have good feedback loops with the clients, you still have to kind of zero in on your vision and strategy and what you believe is true. And it's probably not what the customers are directly asking for, but
yeah,
what you might anticipate they'd ask for. It is really the hardest thing. But then you think one thing that I found is that super smart engineers, I mean, way smarter than mathematicians and just overly brilliant people they would need your vision, your guidance. You're telling them, okay, this is what we're doing. We're not doing anything else. You cannot outsource this decision unless it's like a person specifically tasked with, like a product officer, or like someone who
yeah,
really does their job. It's, and especially since you can go horizontally or vertically, kind of add more features, or you can kind of, one of the things that you do great, you want to do even better. We want to be world class in it. And once you have a larger engineering team and you're like, what do I want to do? There's so many things that I can do. And I know that the kind of the opportunity cost, you see like opportunity cost everywhere, right? You look at the
yeah.
backlog and you're like, my God, I want to get that done and that done and that done, but you can't get anything and everything all done at the same time. So that certainly rings true with
Yeah, yeah.
what you're saying.
Having said that, the other thing that we're very actively working on is like bringing AI into our internal workloads, and building things like connectors is easier now than it was 6 months ago. So, that's something that like we do see that there's acceleration on our team's productivity. But nonetheless, even in that context, you still have to make decisions. We're 14 people today, so and that's mostly engineering. That's still that's not a huge engineering team in the grand scheme of things. So we've got to make real decisions on what it is we're focused on.
Awesome. Well, yeah. So in terms of the ecosystem, how do you see StreamCap with growing with respect to what's happening in Snowflake and Databricks? What do you think is this gap where you can add a lot more value than just telling someone, okay, you need to use the native system and then just build on top of it on your own?
Yeah. So I think like, whether this is, in 6 months or 2 years from now, like, I think both Snowflake and Databricks are obviously building native connectors. And so I do think that like the ELT type of workload is being like commoditized, and in the simpler use cases, will probably just those workloads will go to the Snowflakes and the Databricks of the world. But that's where at the same what we have at the same time is that again, as I said with Iceberg, all of a sudden you don't have to do all of your transformation compute in the warehouse or the data lake, right? So all of a sudden that piece you might bring out into the stream because it's just going to be cheaper there, right? And that's like I say, that's been consistent with what we've seen. So I think that's one piece that like gives me a lot of confidence that we're building in the right direction, is that people want to do they don't necessarily want to do all their compute in the warehouse. And then the other piece is you have a more complex landscape, in at least in our customers typically, where they might have multiple destinations. So for example, if you're using Snowflake for your internal data warehousing and ClickHouse for customer facing, and both of them need data from your databases, it doesn't make a lot of sense to send data from into both and then do compute in both to try and arrive at the same data. It's much more efficient that you actually do the compute and do the transformations in the stream and then send it to both. And then you have several advantages. One, lower latency. Two, you're not running the compute twice in two different databases. And then three, it's more consistent, right? If obviously if you're doing transformation in both places, there's more potential that they become out of sync with one another. So whereas if you just land the same data, it's the same data. Those are the things that I think will be that's where we're focused, I guess I would say, because there's going to continue to be growth there. Where I think some of the simpler workloads, going straight to Snowflake, it's probably
How
more
do
likely to be commoditized.
how do you feel about the scheduling and orchestration part then? Because that was like the Airflow was the standard or is the standard. There's obviously others, and this is also kind of basic orchestration, basic scheduling is also coming into the platform natively, and it's kind of is this the slow, inevitable end of this 10-year reign on the scheduling on part of something open source like Airflow?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, I think there's pressure on like sort of point solutions, let's say, in your stack on from a number of directions, right? Like you have, native tools for orchestration. You have other like I don't know, your DBTs of the world expanding their footprint out in terms of what they do. So I mean, I do think that like there's like a general pressure from buyers that like they got frustrated with the modern data stack and the idea that you needed to have 7 or 8 tools, whether it's a commercial tool or open source, to do everything you wanted to do. And so I think the companies that have survived are buying smaller companies, building more features, and I think like you have expanded offerings that are responding to that kind of market demand. But there's always kind of a cycle on bundling and rebundling, and I think we're definitely broadly in a rebundling phase right now where people are looking for more kind of cohesive solutions.
Yeah, brilliant. So we met in Austin. We met in San Francisco. You're very active in the scene, right? At events, etc. How can people find you and meet you and reach you, and where you headed off next in terms of conferences, etc.?
Yes, I well, LinkedIn is a great place for the latest. But let's see, I've got we've here in San Francisco, we're we have the 1 year anniversary of our low key data meetup that Tony Fancher and I host here coming up next week, or no, on the 3rd. So, and actually, speaking of Austin, we were in Austin at Day to Day Texas with which Lynn Bender hosts, and he's actually kind of joining our low key meetup on the 30th. We're kind of co-hosting it with him because he's putting that together because he's hosting a talk that Jessica Talisman is doing. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff coming together for that. So that's the most
Cheers
immediate
to
thing if
both.
you're in the Bay Area.
Yeah, no,
And
yeah.
then, sorry, go ahead.
No. Sorry, I was just saying hi to Jessica and to Lynn, but
Okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. And then let's see. I'm going to be coming over to Europe. I'm going to what is it? Big Data London in September. And I think that's the next kind of bigger conference, unless I'm forgetting something. And then I think we'll also be at Current Confluence conference and what do you call it? DBT's conference. Both of those are in October, I think. Um, and then I feel like there's one more. I'm not sure if we might have. I don't think I will be there, but I think we might have a presence at Flink Forward in. I think it's in Barcelona. Can't remember, but
Feeling
anyway, yeah.
cool. Well, then, thanks so much for being my guest. Was great hearing your thoughts on this very interesting streaming topic. And yeah, hope to see you soon.
Yeah,
Cheers.
great. I
Bye,
appreciate
everyone.
it, Bill.